Okay, so we've gone over vanity URLs, promo codes, post-purchase survey data. We've gone over the idea of attribution and why it is so important to the industry. Now we are going to go over how Podscribe does attribution and the limitations of the way we do it. I the limit well, it's not our limitations, let's be clear. It's the limitations of the medium itself, of IP addresses. So, okay, let's get started. So here we have this flowchart once again of where money is going. Where does Podscribe come in? Podscribe comes in. Where would it be? It would be here. This is where people come in and help, and get help. And in fact, we actually charge, as of today, which is October 2025, we charge money based on the number of impressions that an agency, advertiser, or publisher tracks on our platform. That is how we charge money. So the more impressions you track, the more money we make. But the relationship between those impressions and the money is that you have to have impressions before you can have attribution, and attribution is not guaranteed. So that's why we charge based on impressions. But we're getting off topic. Sorry. Podscribe helps agencies and publishers come up with a very specific number of conversions that arise from people downloading podcast ads. So that's where we come in. How do we do attribution? It's simple. We get the IP addresses of everyone who listens to the podcast ad, like this. And then we get the IPs of everyone who visits a site or purchases from a site or installs the app. It depends on what the conversion is that needs to be tracked, but we get all of those IPs. So the IPs of all the conversions. Let me go into another tangent here. The word conversions, for the purposes of this course, I'm going to use the word conversions to refer to any and all web events, like an install or a purchase or a view, that want to be tracked, that we want to measure conversions from. So people who came from a podcast ad. And as I said that, I just realized that this is not the right word to use because we don't know if these people are coming from podcast ads. So web events is better. So i.e. visit, purchase, install. Okay. We have to get all of them. We look at both. Whoops. We look at the IPs of everyone who listens to the ad. We look at the IPs of everyone who visits the site or causes the web event. And it's that overlap that is the number of attributed events that we want to track. This is where the gold is. This is where the treasure is. This is the answer to the $1 million question. And because we have the IP address, we can say there were actually 23 people who came from this podcast, or there were actually 60 people who came from this one episode of a podcast, and they spent $1,500 in total. You've spent $500. Your return was $1,000 from this one episode or from this one podcast or whatever that might be. So it allows for precision in measurement that the other methods of calculating attribution couldn't dream of accomplishing. It is so much more precise. And that is why so many people in the marketplace are rushing to sign up with Podscribe. It's because of the precision it gives them to run campaigns. And then you can say, oh, I've spent $1,000 on podcasting. I got 25 conversions. I spent $1,000 on Facebook ads and I got 3 conversions. It is without a doubt better for me to spend the rest of my ad budget in podcasting based on this information that Podscribe provided. Some other things to mention here. We talked about the issues with promo codes and vanity URLs, and to a certain extent, post-purchase survey data. One of those big issues is that people who don't use them are not counted. But this is not the case with attribution based on IPs. People who don't use a promo code, who don't use a vanity URL will still be counted because their IP is all that is needed to get them tracked and into our system. Okay, so and that's the magic of IP-based attribution. We don't have an issue with undercounting the number of conversions. And that's because no one has to do anything special to track them. One thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the people who first come into our platform and who first come into the industry have no idea that this is something that exists. And so many of the questions that I get from new clients and from their clients is something like, where do you add the URL that tracks the conversions? And the answer is there is no URL. This is how we do attribution. You don't even have to press anything or anything like that as a consumer of a podcast and then as a customer to be tracked. You just need to do your thing as you go about, and we track you like that. So it's pretty cool. That's how we do attribution. Now, I hope this makes sense. But now we're going to go into the limitations of IP-based matching, and there are limitations. If vanity URLs and promo codes, if their issue was that they're undercounting people, I think you could make the case that the limitation of IP-based matching is that we overcount people. Okay, here's one limitation. We were looking at the IPs of all podcast listeners. But the thing is, as of October 2025, again, we cannot tell if someone has actually listened to the podcast or if they have just downloaded the podcast. That's because when they download the podcast, that's when we get the IP. But there's no information that we can get. We would love to if we could, but there's no information that we can get about whether someone has actually listened to the podcast that they have downloaded. And I don't know about you, but I have like 15 or 20 different podcast episodes in my Apple Podcasts app that I have not listened to, that I probably never will listen to. So that's an issue, because if someone downloads a podcast and then they go onto the site to visit or purchase, we will be saying that they were coming from the podcast and that it can be attributed to the podcast ad, when in reality it cannot, because they didn't actually listen to the ad. It just looks like that. So that's one instance of overcounting. I think the thing about this that we can say, the counter argument to this would be that it still is valuable to have an exact number one, and two, there are other things that you can do on the dashboard that let you minimize the number of people like this. So it's not the end of the world. The second thing about IPs is the issue of noisy IPs. And so let me show you. Let me draw this out for you. How do we do this? Okay, so we have the list of noisy IPs. Sorry, we have the list of listener IPs, and we have the list of purchaser IPs. We'll use purchases in this case. And it's easy if there's one IP per person, right? That's super easy and straightforward to match people. But what happens if you're at a coffee shop or university where one IP has 1,000 people using it? Then, just because you see one purchase from that IP and one listen from that IP, you cannot be sure that the purchase and the listen came from the same person. It is extremely possible that one person at the university downloaded the ad and another person at the university purchased the product advertised a few minutes or a few hours or a few days later. And if we were to count this as an attributed purchase, we would be attributing incorrectly because that's not what's going on. So the issue is with false positives here. Noisy IPs lead to false positives. And let me draw this out even further so that it is even more clear. There are two types of IPs. There are residential IPs, and then there are noisy IPs. Residential IPs are pretty straightforward. They're usually from residences, like houses or apartments. When I am at home, I use a residential IP. And the idea behind them is when you go home and you connect your device to the internet, your IP address becomes the IP of your home. So you can do this. You can go onto Google and you type in, what is my IP? You will see the IP address of the router that, basically, to sum it up or to simplify, the router that connects you to the internet. And then when you switch from home to work or from work to the university, your IP address will change as you change the network that you are using to join and get onto the internet. So when you're at home, you'll have a residential IP, and the significance of a residential IP is that there's usually only one or two people on it. Just imagine how many people are at your home and the number of people who use that one IP. It's super easy to do attribution on residential IPs because if we see a listen and a purchase from the same IP, chances are that it came from one person. And if not, one person influenced someone else in the household to buy or to visit, something like that. So it's simple to deal with residential IPs because there's usually only one person associated with an IP. Noisy IPs are more difficult. Let's do this. Let's see what happens. So noisy IPs are things like universities or cell towers or coffee shops. We'll do a little coffee shop. I don't know how to draw. We'll do a university. How would I draw a university? There we go. Universities have thousands of people. If we see, and again, we don't know how many people. All we can see is the IP address and an event that comes. So if we see downloads of a podcast ad, and then we see purchases of that product advertised, all we can see is that they come from the same IP. And we cannot tell if those were coming from the same person or not, which is a limitation, because if we were to say, we can just assume yes, we would have so many conversions that no one would want to use us, because everyone would be like, this is unbelievable and it's too good to be true. So we cannot just say it's a strict overlap. In fact, we cannot do attribution for noisy IPs at all using the Venn diagram method that I told you about because of this issue of false positives. So what do we do instead? What we do is we model the conversions from noisy IPs. Let's say, and here's why we can do this. We know how many impressions went out. We know how many went to residential IPs and how many went to noisy IPs. We just don't know how many people converted from noisy IPs. We know how many people converted from residential IPs, because it's easy to do attribution, we just don't know from noisy IPs. So we have a situation here where, let's do gold. Downloads. And then let's do purchases. Again, it doesn't always have to be a purchase. Sometimes it can be an install or a website visit or a sign up, etc., etc. Residential and noisy. We know how many downloads went to residential IPs. We know how many downloads went to noisy IPs. We know how many purchases from those downloads came from residential IPs. We just have to figure out this. How do we do that? I'll show you the math. We do something called modeling, which is extrapolation, and it's very, very simple math. Let's say 1,000 impressions, which means 1,000 downloads, 1,000 legit downloads went to residential homes, residential IPs, and 1,000 went to noisy IPs. And then of those 1,000, there were 5 purchases. The question is, how many came from this 1,000 here? The answer is, we'll take the ratio from the residential IPs and we'll apply that to the number of noisy impressions to get this number here. So the answer here is 5 because there were 1,000 downloads. But let's go through the math just so you can be crystal clear about how it's done. So 1,000 divided by, or 5 over 1,000, you can barely see that. 5 over 1,000, 0.5%. Okay, if we take 0.5% of 1,000, we'll get 5. That's how the math works. So what this means is, on the PodScribe dashboard, there will be 2,000 impressions in total, and there will be 10 purchases in total. That's what we'll show. And if someone turns off the modeling, they'll see 2,000 impressions and 5 purchases in total. Let's do another example. This is really important to know because a frequently asked question is, why do I not see as many conversions in my individual conversions report as I do on the dash? And the answer is, the individual conversions report shows you just the conversions from the residential IPs, but the dash shows you the numbers from both the residential IPs and the noisy IPs. Anyway, okay. Example number 2. Let's go with this one. This one looks nice. No. There were 100 impressions that went to a residential IP. There were 500 that went to a noisy IP. Of the 100, there were 15 purchases, which is ridiculous. How many would have come from the noisy IPs? Well, 100 over 15 is, 115 over 100 is equal to 0.15 or 15%, which is pretty obvious if you look at this number. So we just need to take 500, multiply it by 0.15 to get the number of conversions from noisy IPs, which would be 75. So then on the dashboard, you'll see 600 impressions and 75 plus 15 conversions, which is 90. 600 impressions, 90 conversions from this one campaign. Okay, that's the limitation of IP-based matching. There's no single source of attribution that solves everyone's problems. Each has their strengths, each has their weaknesses. Some are a lot more complex to implement than others. We've talked about promo codes and vanity URLs. That's usually what people do when they first get into podcast advertising. And then when a company gets bigger and wants to get more in depth and get more analytical and measure things more accurately, they then start using IP-based matching like what Podscribe offers.